Almost 21 years ago, my wife Carrie and I began the process of adopting a child. As we waited for the call that we had been selected, we prepared a nursery, started gathering supplies, read some books on parenting, made plans to take time off work, and began thinking of names. I will never forget that process. We'd pitch names at each other on a pretty regular basis, easily tossing aside some while holding on to others until we had narrowed down the list to a pretty short one. Well, a short list of first names anyway. The middle name was already decided. If it was a boy, the middle name would be Len, spelled L-E-N. If it was a girl, her middle name would be Lynn, spelled L-Y-N-N-E. Why? Because Len was my biological father's middle name. He had died several years earlier and would be the only grandparent that would not be an active part of our child's life. But we wanted him to be a part of our child's story. 20 years ago this week, Ethan Len Gerard came into the world. And from the very beginning of his life, we have told him the story of his name and why it is so very special. While the process of choosing a name for a child is different in each family, there is often a story behind why one name is chosen over all the other possibilities. This was certainly true for some of the names of those whose stories are told throughout the pages of Scripture. A biblical name often reflects an event, a location, a physical attribute, or even a hope or a dream. It was the latter that shaped the name of one of the first major figures in Scripture, a child born to parents who hoped and dreamed that their son would extend the family legacy by having many children. So they named him Abram, which meant exalted father. Around the same time, another family gave birth to a baby girl. They were so enamored and overwhelmed with adoration with their newborn child that they named her Sarai, which meant my princess. Eventually, Abram and Sarai would meet and become husband and wife. But in spite of their efforts and their prayers, they were unable to have children, and the longer this went on, the more ironic and even painful Abram's name became for him. You see, while it is perfectly normal and possible for people to live full and meaningful lives without having children today, back in that day, things were very different. Children were not only your legacy, they were your lifeline. They could help provide for the family, and when you aged, they would help take care of you. For a person with no children to be called exalted father was a daily reminder of hopes, dreams, and a life of greater security going unrealized. This was not how Abram's story was supposed to play out, and it was certainly not what Sarai had in mind for her life either. It just wasn't supposed to be this way. I felt a bit like Abram and Sarai lately. Not because of anything having to do with the number of children I have. I am good there. I'm talking about the fact that the story of my life does not look like what I thought it would right now. I know I'm not alone in this. After all, when we were making our plans for how we'd spend the year 2020, how many of us had our current situation in mind? Like so many others, our family had a lot of expectations how this year would play out in terms of travel, education, work, and other life experiences. But by the middle of March, we had canceled 2 trips. Our oldest son had moved back home from college. Both of our sons were finishing their school years remotely. My wife's nonprofit was seeing more clients than ever due to financial hardships, and I was learning how to become a televangelist. The story of our life was being written in ways we never saw coming and wish had never happened. And as disruptive as all of this has been for us, so far the rewrite of our story has not included the depths of suffering that so many others have experienced. While the extent to which it has happened is different for all of us, each of us, all of our stories have been rewritten over the course of this year. And if you are anything like me, you're wondering where our stories are headed. The good news, as the story of Abram and Sarai and the stories of so many others of our faith ancestors reminds us, God specializes in rewritten stories and unexpected endings. When Abram was 75 years old, the Lord came to him in a vision, telling him that he and Sarah would not only have children, but that their descendants would number like the stars in the sky. This news seemed too good to be true, given that they would then go another 24 years without having a child together. And in that time, Abram and Sarai began to wonder if their story would ever have the ending that God had promised. Then, on his 99th birthday, God spoke to Abram. This time, God told him that his name would no longer be Exalted Father, but instead, the Father of Nations. And from that point on, Abram was called Abraham. Then God proclaimed that Sarai would now be called Sarah, changing the meaning of her name from being like a princess to her parents to meaning she would be the princess of all people. Not long after changing their names, God sent word that they would give birth to a child. Upon hearing this, Sarah, who was 90 at the time, laughed out loud at the absurdity of the idea. And yet, they did conceive. And Sarah gave birth to a son, and Abraham named him Isaac, which meant laughter. His name, telling the unlikely story of his birth and his parents' response to hearing that it happened. In that moment, their story had been rewritten in the most remarkable and surprising of ways that no one ever saw coming or would have believed possible. And over time, their descendants would indeed number like the stars, and that number keeps growing even today. Last Monday, our youngest son, Graham, began practicing with the North Oldham High School marching band, something he loves more than words can describe. In order for him to participate, we had to sign a liability waiver, stating that even if it was caused by negligence on their end, we cannot hold the school system or its staff responsible should Graham contract COVID-19. Signing that form gave me pause. It was a moment where his story was going to go one of two ways. Either he participates or he stays home. We signed the form. In just over a month, Graham's school will open, and we are being told to expect a normal schedule. About that same time, Ethan will return to college, where we are being told they too will be holding in-person classes and activities. Both of these realities make my heart beat a little faster. Every day, my wife leaves our home and steps up to the front line of service in the response to the needs of those in our community who have been impacted by COVID-19 and the loss of income. And it seems as each week passes, we learn of another person we know and care about who has been diagnosed with COVID-19, has lost their job, or is experiencing some kind of economic impact. Add to all this the rising racial tensions, violence, and political discord, and it can be hard to feel any real certainty about where our story is going. I've talked with more than a few people who are anxious and worried about the future. When I am at my best, when I'm breathing deep and praying often, when I'm reading stories like that of Abraham and Sarah and the many others who fill the pages of the Bible, I am much more at peace about where we are headed. To be clear, I'm not engaging in some kind of magical thinking that if I pray hard enough and have enough faith, everything will be okay. Even the most faithful among us, and among those in Scripture, by the way, still experienced hardship and struggle. That said, If God can rewrite the story of a man wrongfully charged, executed, and buried in a tomb into a victory over death and a promise of grace and reconciliation for us all, I am pretty confident that God can help us shape where our story goes from here. Over the next several weeks, we're going to dig into more scriptural stories of lives rewritten through the presence and grace of God. As part of our journey, we're going to be using a book written by Jessica LaGrone called The Rewritten Life to shape our series and to be the center of our Sunday morning and Wednesday evening online studies. I think you'll find that the series is not only timely, it is filled with a message of hope that is found in the good news that the God who, according to the book of Hebrews, is the author and perfecter of our faith, is always with us. And as long as we set our eyes on Christ, we will be able to run the race that has been set before us, regardless of where it might lead. Amen.